In the hills of Bethlehem, where the sun caresses the fields and the air smells of fresh earth, the story of a young man who would change the destiny of a nation began. His name was David, a shepherd with a brave heart and an unshakable spirit. But his life would not be one of mere tranquility and flocks. He was destined for something far greater, to be the king of Israel. This is the story of a man who, from the humility of the fields, rose to the greatness of a throne. A story of faith, courage, mistakes, and redemption. A story that reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, the light of hope never fades. David was not the strongest or the tallest of his brothers. In fact, when the prophet Samuel arrived at his father Jesse's house to seek the future king of Israel, David wasn't even present. His brothers, strong and handsome men, stood before Samuel, but none of them was the chosen one. It was then that Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse remembered David, the youngest, who was in the field tending the sheep. When David arrived, his face glowing with the innocence of youth, Samuel knew this was the one. With a flask of oil in his hand, the prophet anointed David as the future king of Israel. No one could have imagined it. A simple shepherd chosen to rule. While tending his father's sheep, David not only learned to care for his flock, but also to protect it from the dangers lurking in the wilderness. On more than one occasion, he faced lions and bears that threatened his sheep. With only a staff and a sling, David showed extraordinary courage, saving his animals from the claws of wild beasts. These experiences not only strengthened his body but also his faith. David learned to trust in something greater than himself, something that guided and protected him in moments of danger. This faith would be his greatest weapon in the challenges to come. But before becoming king, David would face a test that would define his faith and courage. In a valley called Elah, a giant named Goliath challenged the entire army of Israel. For 40 days, Goliath mocked the Israelite soldiers, who trembled in fear at his presence. David, sent by his father to bring supplies to his brothers on the battlefield, heard the giant's taunts. While everyone retreated, David stepped forward with a question that echoed in the air. Who is this Philistine that he should defy the living God? With only a sling and 5 stones, David faced the Colossus. It wasn't his weapons that made him strong, but his trust in something greater than himself. With a single shot, the stone found its mark and the giant fell. The Philistine army fled, and David became a hero. But this victory wasn't just over Goliath. It was a victory of faith over fear, of the small over the seemingly invincible. His feat brought him to the court of King Saul, where his talent for music soothed the tormented spirit of the monarch. David played the harp with such sweetness that, at times, Saul's torment faded. But the friendship would not last forever. Jealousy and fear took hold of Saul, who saw in David not just a loyal servant, but a threat to his throne. Every time the people sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands," the king's heart filled with envy. Soon, David became a fugitive, pursued by the man he once served. In the desert, David found refuge. There, surrounded by loyal men who joined his cause, he learned what it meant to lead with humility and justice. Though a fugitive, David never lost hope. He knew his destiny was in God's hands. At night, under a sky full of stars, David wrote psalms that reflected his heart. Sometimes filled with anguish, other times with praise, but always seeking God's presence. It was in the desert that David demonstrated his integrity. On 2 occasions, he had the chance to end Saul's life, but he chose forgiveness over vengeance. "I will never raise my hand against the Lord's anointed," he said. His respect for divine will set him apart as a man of deep faith. David's life was not an easy path. After his victory over Goliath, the young shepherd found himself fleeing through the desert, pursued by King Saul, who saw him as a threat. But even in the darkest moments, David never lost hope. He knew his destiny was in God's hands. In the desert, David found refuge. There, surrounded by loyal men who joined his cause, he learned what it meant to lead with humility and justice. Though a fugitive, David never lost hope. He knew his destiny was in God's hands. At night, under a sky full of stars, David wrote psalms that reflected his heart, sometimes filled with anguish, other times with praise, but always seeking God's presence. It was in the desert that David demonstrated his integrity. On 2 occasions, he had the chance to end Saul's life, but he chose forgiveness over vengeance. "I will never raise my hand against the Lord's anointed," he said. His respect for divine will set him apart as a man of deep faith. David's life took a dramatic turn when Saul and his son Jonathan, David's closest friend, died in the Battle of Gilboa. Though Saul had been his enemy, David deeply mourned his death and that of Jonathan. He composed a song in their honor, known as the Song of the Bow, where he expressed his grief and love for his friend. With Saul's death, the path was clear for David to ascend to the throne. But it would not be an easy journey. The nation was divided, and David would have to unite a fractured people. After Saul's death, David was crowned king of Judah in Hebron. But it wasn't until 7 years later that all the tribes of Israel recognized him as their king. Under his leadership, the nation flourished. He conquered Jerusalem, made it his capital, and brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city, establishing a place of worship and unity for his people. David was not just a warrior and a king, he was also a poet. His psalms, filled with praise, repentance, and trust in God, have inspired generations. In them, we find the heart of a man who, despite his mistakes, always sought God's presence. As king, David led several successful military campaigns that expanded Israel's territory. He defeated the Philistines, Moabites, Syrians, and other enemies, establishing Israel's dominance in the region. Each victory was further proof that God was with him, guiding his steps and strengthening his hand. But not everything was glory and triumph. David also faced personal and family challenges that would test his faith and character. One of David's most touching acts as king was his mercy toward Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. Despite being part of Saul's family, David treated him with kindness and restored all the lands that had belonged to his grandfather. He also gave him a place at his table, showing that loyalty and compassion were fundamental values in his reign. This act of mercy not only honored Jonathan's memory, but also demonstrated that David was a man who valued justice and kindness over vengeance. David, the shepherd who became king, had reached the height of his power. Under his leadership, Israel had become a strong and united nation. But even the greatest men face moments of weakness and error. Despite his great achievements, David was not immune to mistakes. One of the darkest moments of his life occurred when, from the terrace of his palace, he saw Bathsheba, the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers, Uriah. Drawn to her beauty, David made a grave mistake that would mark his reign. David brought Bathsheba to his palace, and their relationship resulted in a pregnancy. In a desperate attempt to cover up his error, David called Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would spend the night with his wife. But Uriah, showing unwavering loyalty, refused to enjoy comforts while his comrades fought. Failing in his plan, David took an even more drastic decision. He ordered Uriah to be placed in the line of fire, where he would be killed. After Uriah's death, David took Bathsheba as his wife. But this act did not go unnoticed. The prophet Nathan confronted David, exposing his sin and announcing the consequences that would follow. David, deeply repentant, wrote one of his most moving psalms, Psalm 51, where he cried out for God's forgiveness. The consequences of David's sin did not take long to appear. His family was plunged into conflict and tragedy. One of his sons, Amnon, committed a terrible act against his half-sister Tamar, which led another son, Absalom, to take revenge by killing Amnon. Absalom, filled with bitterness, rebelled against David and proclaimed himself king. David was forced to flee Jerusalem, and the nation was plunged into civil war. Although David eventually regained the throne, his heart was shattered by the death of Absalom, whom he deeply loved. Amid these tragedies, David once again demonstrated his faith and capacity to forgive. Despite the pain, he never lost sight of the fact that God was his refuge and strength. In his final years, David focused on preparing his son Solomon to be the next king. Although David desired to build a temple for God, he was told that this task would be fulfilled by his son. Instead of building the temple, David made extensive preparations, gathering materials and organizing the work that would be needed. David instructed Solomon in wisdom and the fear of God, giving him advice on how to govern the kingdom according to God's laws. "Be strong and courageous," he said, "and keep the commandments of God." With Solomon's coronation, David secured the continuity of his legacy. Though he could not build the temple, his vision and preparation laid the foundation for one of the most important works in Israel's history. David's story is a reminder that even the greatest men can fall, but they can also rise again. Through his mistakes and triumphs, David teaches us that faith, repentance, and redemption are possible. David was not just a king. He was a man who sought God with all his heart. His psalms, filled with praise, repentance, and trust in God, have inspired generations. In them, we find the heart of a man who, despite his flaws, always sought God's presence. David's legacy is one of the most significant in Israel's history. He unified the nation, established Jerusalem as its capital, and left a lineage from which the Messiah would come. His life shows us that, with God, even the biggest dreams can come true. The stories that changed the world still have so much to teach us today. Are you ready to discover them all? If you're passionate about these epic stories, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss any of the adventures we still have to tell. Every week, a new story that will make you see the past in a whole new way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, full of action, lessons, and surprises.